at Parsha Mitzorah, which is the second week in a row that our Torah has decided to take us on a tangent from our narrative in the desert and narrative building the tabernacle to focus solely on skin lesions and bumps that appear on the skin. Now, I don't know if anybody here is a dermatologist, but these two parshiot, Tazria last week and Mitzorah this week, oftentimes make it very difficult for us to identify with what we're reading. What relevance does reading about a Iron Age illness or pathogen that demands quarantine have to do with our lives today? And this isn't just a question that we have today in 2022. This is a question that's been at the focus of Jewish tradition. What is this enigmatic or elusive illness that the Torah calls tsarat? We started off last week's parsha by just reading, if a person has a skin on the body, a swelling, rash, or discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affliction on the skin of the body, then that person needs to undergo a certain procedure. So, of course, as Jews like to do, there's a whole discussion and debate, an attempt to understand what tsarat is. So probably the most obvious route to go, right, when reading over and over about specific skin afflictions, the color, the size, is to suggest that this was a very early attempt at some sort of medical textbook, right? One could imagine, right, in the ancient world, just as our world today, plagues would come through ancient cities and ancient civilizations, and being able to spot the early warning signs in a type of skin rash or disease that would immediately proliferate throughout the area was very important to catch in the early stages. And so perhaps the 2 out of 54 parshiot, about 4% of the Torah that it spends talking about these skin lesions, perhaps this is an early attempt to keep us safe. This is, of course, how Maimonides, the 12th century philosopher and doctor, wanted to understand these skin afflictions in tsarat. And he goes through, and one can read in Maimonides, and he goes through every single detail that the Torah delineates for what to do lest somebody break out with the skin illness, and he attempts to connect it to the science that he knew at the time from being in 12th century Spain. Now, of course, there's immediate problems to there. First and foremost, the Torah doesn't tell us how to combat the flu, doesn't tell us how to do ancient surgery, right? So why specifically this illness? Was this really that much worse than anything that happened in the ancient world? And so other Jewish thinkers say, perhaps tsarat, perhaps this skin illness that the Torah spends so much time talking about, isn't actually a physical plague, but perhaps it's representative of something internal. Perhaps the external breaking out of the skin into specific bumps and lesions and discolorations is representative of a deeper spiritual illness on the inside. And so the rabbis in the Talmud go through and try to figure out, okay, tsarat, or somebody who has a tsarat, is called a mitzorah. And so the rabbis are very clever, and they say, well, mitzorah kind of sounds like the 3 Hebrew words motzi shem ra, somebody who goes around spreading bad words or bad ideas. And there's an attempt by the rabbis to say perhaps tsarat is representative of some internal spiritual illness of people who go around talking ill about each other. There's some interesting biblical support, right? If we wanted to sit here for the rest of the day, we can do a full analysis of the Tanakh for all of the examples. I won't do that, all jokes about Shabbat HaGadol on the side, but just 2 interesting examples of when we actually see tsarat come out throughout the narrative of the Torah. We can imagine Moses, the first time he's talking to God, he seems like he's very slow to want to commit. And one of the things that he says is, well, I'm not so sure the Israelites that are in Egypt are going to listen to me, right? Moses is bad-mouthing the Israelites. And God says, okay, Moses, you know what? Stick your hand into your coat. And he does, and lo and behold, Moses takes it out, and it's full of tsarat. The second scenario of tsarat actually happens in the next book of the Torah, the book of Numbers, where we have a similar situation with Miriam, Moses' older sister, speaking ill about Moses, and she also gets this enigmatic skin illness and has to quarantine outside the camp. But at this point, personally, I'm not settled here, right? And I can't imagine anybody that's sitting here says, that's why the Torah decides to spend hundreds and hundreds of verses talking about this vague skin illness, because it's representative of some internal illness, right? It's a nice idea. And there's a certain beauty that I just want to highlight in the fact that our sages attempted to connect physical illnesses that were in the world to going around and spreading ill ideas about others, right? It's a nice idea, but I think we're still lacking something. So we open up Rachel Adler, right, a contemporary Jewish philosopher and theologian. And Rachel Adler takes a step back. And what she says is any attempt to try to understand this skin affliction by a medical point of view or even by a spiritual point of view is missing something. Instead, here's what Sarat teaches us. She writes that societies, communities dread invasion. We dread disintegration and inundation, hence the extremities and borders of our nation. And our bodies, too, are loci of concern, places where integrity might be breached and order overthrown. Human skin is a long, continuous boundary that demarcates the most basic of borders, the border between the human body and the world outside it. Breaches in the skin, such as those of Sarat, are attacks on our body's wholeness. They leave the raw flesh vulnerable to the external world or display flesh taken over by externalities. What Professor Adler is saying is our skin, that on the external of our body, is fundamentally the most protective layer that we have in terms of our relationship with the outside world. Our skin is something that acts as a border, really a layer of protection between our internal makeup, our internal organs, everything that we deem important, and the dangers that we know too well to be ubiquitous throughout the world. Then feeling safe in our skin, right? The idea that we're comfortable, the idea that our skin is smooth and not vulnerable to attack is simultaneously a privilege. People who are lucky enough to have physical safety, it's a personal privilege. And subsequently, it's also paramount for any ability or chance to reach our full potential. So we understand then with Sarat, the metaphor of a breach in our skin isn't just something that's physically and externally troubling, but fundamentally it seems to uproot all order. If we don't have safety from the external forces that are constantly trying, in terms of the metaphor of the body, trying to get in and attack, or if we think writ large in terms of society, the forces outside of society constantly trying to uproot it, it threatens all order, all things important. This idea has especially been on my mind the past 2 weeks as we've been reading these parshiot, both from a particularist Jewish perspective, as we've seen now a whole array of terrorist attacks happening all throughout the country of Israel. There's been 4 murderous terrorist attacks in the past 2 weeks alone. And in terms of a more universalist perspective, as we sit there horrified, glued to the news, seeing the images coming out of Ukraine. Just as a person, just as everybody here, just as every human has a right to feel safe and comfortable in their own skin, so too countries, citizens, even humans of the world have a fundamental right to feel the same. An external breach, something coming in from the outside, threatens to disrupt all order and all ability, both for an individual and for a nation to self-actualize. So we take a step back. So what's the fix? What's the tikkun, as we say in Jewish tradition? Right? There's so much tragedy. There's so much sarat, things that are threatening all order around us. So we get into the nitty-gritty details of this week's Parsha. And Parsha Metzora gives us ritual after ritual to what to do when you have these skin lesions. And first we know the person has to be separated from the community. So we take a period of isolation. We take time where we demand that when these afflictions break out, we have time to think about it. Let's not get into a mindset, the Torah is telling us, where we jump from tragedy to tragedy, where if something pops up on our skin or if something pops up on the news, we actually take time to reflect on it. We don't just say, okay, I have this mark here, or we have this negative thing here, let's move on. But the Torah is also concerned with being overwhelmed. The Torah is also concerned with a mindset that can quickly seep into lachrymosity and sorrow. And how can we even get out of bed in the morning because there's so much negativity? And so the Torah caps that period of quarantine due to tzarat. The Torah says, take 8 days in this week's Torah portion. 8 days is just above an average cycle, right? If we think of the cycle of a week, right? Just a little bit more than an average week cycle. And then after, return to the community and go back and take the ideas that you've thought about in your solitude once you have tzara'at and bring it back to the community to try to re-engage, right? We try to take the middle ground between ignoring every tragedy and becoming so overwhelmed by it, we can't move on. There's a story in the Talmud, one of my favorite stories, because it's the subject of so much discussion and debate, where we're introduced to Rabbi Joshua, who's walking through the marketplaces of the Galilee, and he bumps into Elijah the prophet, right, as rabbis in the Talmud often did, and he has one question for Elijah the prophet. How can I find the Messiah, right? This is in a time in Jewish history, if we recall, the temple was just destroyed, there's uproar all around, right? There's tragedy everywhere. And so understandably, the rabbis, the leaders of the community, were looking for some sort of panacea, right? Where is the Messiah, right? How can I find him? What is the key to unlocking all of our sorrow? And so Elijah says, of course, he's sitting by the gates of Rome among all the homeless people. And so Joshua says, okay, but how am I going to know which person he is? And Elijah says, well, we know that everybody by the gates of Rome, they're afflicted with tzara'at, right? They have the skin illness that our portion is talking about, right? And you're going to see, what you notice is you're going to see the people sitting by the gates, and they spend all day unwrapping all of their bandages and rewrapping all of their bandages because it's itchy, because they don't want it to get infected. And the Messiah, he's the one that instead of unwrapping all the bandages and then rewrapping all the bandages, he's unwrapping one bandage at a time, looking at it, making sure that it's healed, rewrapping it, and doing that for all the other bandages. The idea that a better future, what we're hoping for, the entire point of Judaism, to take us from this idea of premortal chaos, where there are no rules, where boundaries have no meaning, where countries can be invaded, citizens can be attacked when they're in bars and coffee shops. The entire tikkun in Judaism is try to create a little bit of order, to try to go step by step, not viewing it as we can hit a home run on the first pitch, but understanding that if we take our time, if we wrap one bandage at a time, if we try to view our problems as fixable one at a time instead of getting burdened and weighed down by the totality of them, we realize that one day we can find the Messiah sitting there by the gates of Rome. In Judaism, the answer to tragedy and despair, to a difficult news cycle, the answer to tzara'at, the skin affliction, is never ignoring it, and it's never despair, but it's always a call to action. Shabbat Shalom.